The term foodgasms wasn't really something I thought would become much of a thing in my lifetime, but thanks to the explosive popularity of Shokugeki no Soma, or Food Wars, the idea of an orgasmically delicious meal that literally rips people's clothes off in their expression of gustatory ecstasy has become synonymous with the franchise. And I can fully understand the hype behind the series, as I too was wrapped up in the crazy cook-offs that took place, leading all the way up to the end of the central arc in Season 4. But I'm not here to discuss Shokugeki no Soma. I'm here to explain to you that not only did a food-elicited orgasm series already exist before Shokugeki no Soma, both in anime and manga format,
よかった。こういう食べ方するのうちの子だけじゃなかった。
but that the anime also has a better soundtrack, and that series is Koufuku Graffiti, or Gourmet Girl Graffiti, a sadly overlooked series that's been overshadowed by countless other cooking-themed shows. Now, let's not make the mistake of assuming that better means more intense. Shokugeki no Soma at its core is a battle shonen series that just substitutes actual fighting with cook-offs. Of course it's going to have more intense music than the slice-of-life, cute girls doing cute things show that is Koufuku Graffiti. I'm also not saying that Shokugeki no Soma has a bad soundtrack. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. I love Kato Tatsuya's music wholeheartedly, but there's a story to be told in almost every track from Koufuku Graffiti's soundtrack, such that it's made composer-performer Kotringo one of my favorite Japanese artists. Though I will admit that the foodgasms in Shokugeki no Soma are infinitely more entertaining to watch. Despite my love for the soundtrack, the reason I've even listened to it is because I wanted to download the OP single and accidentally hit the download button for the OST instead. After watching the show for the first time, I'll be honest and say that I didn't really remember what any of the background music sounded like, aside from this little beauty that played at the end of every episode. Whether that was because of brilliant immersion into the atmosphere of the show and really good overall sound design, or maybe just an unmemorable soundtrack in general, I figured it couldn't hurt to give the OST a listen before deciding if it was worth keeping in my library. Instead of deliberating its worth, however, I ended up getting just as heavily invested in the Wonderland-esque sounds of Kotringo's compositions as I had of Rasmus Faber and Sakamoto Maya's brilliant OP performance. I mean, just listen to this stuff. It's hard for me to properly describe in more analytical terms what makes this music brilliant because it's honestly just so pretty that I get too lost to think about it on a higher level. Not that it isn't also really intellectual stuff. It's pretty obvious that there are a ton of things going on, and those layers! What blows me away about so many of these tracks is that the arrangements and instrumentation just sort of flow from beginning to end without ever feeling out of place. And while you'd expect that's what most music sounds like, Kotringo makes use of a wide variety of instruments that you might expect to clash with each other.
Is mayonnaise an instrument?
No, Patrick, mayonnaise is not an instrument.
Or at the very least, need to be arranged so that they're playing together rather than flowing from one to the next.
Horseradish is not an instrument either.
Maybe it's her jazz background speaking to my lack of jazz training, but I absolutely love the overall flow of her music as it drifts seamlessly from one part to the next. And let's not forget about the way she magically seems to blend her own voice in with the arrangements as if it's just another instrument. I mean, it is another instrument, but she has this amazing sort of glassy, woodwind-esque timbre to her voice that I would absolutely kill to write for her. She doesn't actually say any real words in the entire soundtrack, just la and other melodic oohs and ahs, but it helps her voice blend in perfectly so that we aren't suddenly distracted by what it is she's saying or trying to get across. All we need to know is this food is tasty and this is how you should feel when you eat it. It's one thing to have your clothes explode when you taste Soma's food, it's another thing entirely when the music of Koufuku Graffiti alone is enough to make you feel like you're lying in a grassy meadow on a warm spring day, staring up at the blue sky as the clouds drift by while you're sharing the perfect amount of a delicately flavored pastry with your significant other, whom you've also just finished making love to. There are a lot of soundtracks that can generate sensations, but Koufuku Graffiti's is just on a level of its own. At this point, a lot of you probably think that I have some sort of bias because I must love the show to bits, but to be honest, I've only seen the show once, and that was back when it was airing in 2015. Not that I can't love a show I've only seen once, considering that I've only watched Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood once, but given that the subject matter really wasn't overly exciting or incredibly memorable, aside from the food reactions and the end card song, my thoughts on the show aren't even remotely the same as my thoughts on the soundtrack. So I've rewatched the show once more since writing the script, mostly so that I could properly put this video together, but my thoughts are basically still the same as they were at the time of writing. I mentioned in my previous video that I'm a sucker for well-arranged large ensembles. Now, I'm a sucker for a good orchestral ensemble, or really any large ensemble that's been well-arranged and written for.
See, I did say that.
The main reason being that the lush beauty of a full orchestra just can't be reproduced or captured with smaller ensembles. But Kotringo doesn't let the sparsity of a chamber ensemble hold her back, and her instrumentation and writing somehow manages to transcend the close intimacy of a smaller ensemble to feel grand and luxurious at times. And while this effect is usually achieved with small ensembles like the string quartet or woodwind quintet, these are well-known, common groupings of instruments that have a long history of working well together to create a full-textured sound. Meanwhile, in the main theme of Koufuku Graffiti, we have an ensemble comprised of your standard piano, flute, oboe, clarinet, and bassoon, and then a marimba and celesta just because, and an accordion because, well, why the hell not? Yes, anyone with a knowledge of instrumentation will see that we have the entire range of an orchestra covered easily. But blending these sounds together is the tricky part, and Kotringo manages to pull it off perfectly while adding her own voice into the mix on top of it all. You don't hear much about women composers, but they certainly aren't people to look down upon, especially in Japan's music scene. And it isn't just the one track that utilizes instruments you wouldn't normally mix together. Throughout the soundtrack, the accordion is frequently utilized in various contexts, sometimes as a slow melodic drone, and other times as the centerpiece for a full-on Russian dance track. Other weirdly intriguing instruments used with the more standard instruments are castanets paired with a recorder and the aforementioned accordion for a samba about eggs, banjo, stand-up bass, and tambourine bluegrass trio mixed with a string quartet and piano for a track about onigiri and karage, and a piece about sakura mochi, played with bass clarinet, celesta, and whistlers. Yes, you heard me correctly, whistlers, as in people who whistle. Tringo also makes use of the themes in the show quite well, pairing the three main girls' character themes with a more specific food theme that they've either made or shared with the others. This also goes for the show's main theme being paired with the hot pot theme, where Ryo and Kirin first came together to enjoy a hearty meal that led to their friendship. My personal favorite amongst these, though, is Sheena's theme and its variation椎名さんのりんご飴, aka Sheena's candy apple, which, ironically, doesn't actually play when Sheena gives her candy apple to Kirin. Go figure. The original theme itself is interesting in that it's the only non-acoustic track in the whole soundtrack and sounds strangely like a tune you might hear in an SNES game. It has the cool kind of minimalist jazz vibe that you might picture in some kind of 16-bit space jazz bar. And admittedly, it does seem a bit out of place with the rest of the soundtrack, which is why it seems smart that it actually doesn't get heard until after the food version of the track does, at least on the album. In this way, we're already introduced to and familiar with the melody and structure of the piece, softening the slightly jarring nature of a sudden non-acoustic track in an otherwise entirely acoustic soundtrack. And the food version is an absolute minimalist dream, perfectly balancing delicacy and floatiness to create a piece that just sort of carries you along with it. It is a bit strange to have such a short minimalist piece, given that by definition, a minimalist piece of music is repetitive and makes gradual changes over a long period of time. But it's beautiful nonetheless, and somewhat reminiscent of Hisai Shijo's concert music. I'd also be super remiss if I didn't mention the OP track, 幸せについて私が知っている5つの方法, considering it's the entire reason I accidentally stumbled across the OST in the first place. Rasmus Faber and Sakamoto Maya are kind of a powerhouse duo when it comes to making music. You may be familiar with another track they teamed up for, Waiting for the Rain, which, to this day, is still one of my favorite ED tracks of all time, and is, unfortunately, far better than the show it was written for in almost every single way. He's a jazz-trained electronic producer, and she's arguably the best female singer as far as Japanese voice actors are concerned. And these things really show when you start delving a little deeper into the music, as the arrangement features not one, but two key changes that occur regularly throughout the song, transitioning in ways that speak to both Rasmus Faber's jazz influence and Sakamoto Maya's incredible singing ability. Now, fair warning, you'd better prepare yourself because it's time for
the technical musical jargon for the big-brained music weebs corner.
See, it isn't uncommon for pop songs to change keys once, usually from the chorus to the bridge, but this is usually used to have some sort of dramatic effect on the listener, forcing them to take on the emotional impact of the song's new section. But this song uses its transitions not so much for dramatic effect as it does for musical storytelling and an unfolding turn of events. The lyrics themselves are just sort of cutesy words about the feelings of happiness and the need to express them to someone you love, hence the song's title meaning the 5 keys to happiness that I know of. But the music takes you through a sort of journey, rising and releasing tension as the initial E-flat Dorian key shifts into C major for the pre-chorus before coming back to E-flat Dorian for the second verse, which pulls you away from the actual chorus to build more anticipation for it the next time around. A common but super effective technique that gets employed in J-pop music fairly often. This then shifts again into C major for the second pre-chorus, but rather than coming back to E-flat Dorian, the music sets up to release an explosion of happiness that spills out from Sakamoto Maya's voice. The vocal line builds higher and higher while the key shifts not into E-flat Dorian, but into B-flat major, dispelling the sort of darker aura of the chords we heard earlier. This is pretty significant as the notes in the E-flat Dorian scale are the same as the B-flat minor scale, meaning that the song has essentially gone back to the same key it was in before, but shifted it from a minor to a major scale. As the chorus comes to a close, we slow down and come to the bridge, allowing some of the electronic backing to drop out as the arrangement simplifies to singing, drums, and bass, with a bit of electronics and strings to keep the texture from getting too sparse too suddenly. This leads into a relatively quiet repetition of the C major pre-chorus, dropping the drums and essentially backing the singing with only bass and some electronic pads and arps. As it gets closer to the chorus, the drums begin to tease the cymbals and hi-hat a bit, cueing up the chorus before exploding back into an extended version of the high-flying B-flat major chorus that by contrast now sounds even bigger and happier than it did previously. I can't speak too much to the actual songwriting and lyricism, as my Japanese is only good enough to understand the subject matter without much knowledge of the structural and artistic writing that occurs. But the rhythmic and melodic qualities of the vocal line are certainly nothing to scoff at, and further proof that Sakamoto Maya is best girl. But, I mean, was that ever up for debate?
君は魔女を口説く才能があるのかもしれないな。
And so I don't think there's much need for a final verdict, as my thoughts are quite clearly skewed towards being absolutely in love with this soundtrack. It's honestly just so fun, cute, and evocative that even if it doesn't have the epic and emotional tracks that its battle shonen counterpart does, it manages to hit all the right beats and leave me with super fond memories of the show, even if I can hardly remember anything from the show itself. It isn't super often that I find myself getting attached to the music in slice-of-life comedies or cute girls doing cute things shows, but the few that I can think of off the top of my head absolutely destroy a lot of their more epic competition. But I'm still just one guy, and my music taste is just as terrible as the next person's. So let me know down in the comments what you guys think of Koufuku Graffiti's soundtrack, and if you think I'm wrong for saying that it's better than Shokugeki no Soma's. I mean, I'm not wrong, but whatever. As always, like and subscribe, and if you'd like to support the channel, you can go over to my Patreon and become a patron so that I can keep sharing my terrible taste in music. Thanks again for checking out the video, and I'll see you in the next one.